Welcome back, everyone. Oh, no, you're good. Welcome back, everyone. We are in Senate Committee on Institutions, and it is February 19th. And we are returning to our meeting, and now we will discuss S69, which is an act relating to an age-appropriate design code. And we have three witnesses. And this is just the second day that we've been discussing this legislation, and we have folks here today generally to explain to us and answer our questions regarding the purpose of the bill and the harms that we are attempting to solve. So, Robbie, thank you for being here. You are the first of the witnesses, and the title I have you is Researcher and Technologist, which is an interesting title, and then Anxious Generation. So that is our concern, is my concern. Some of our concerns that we do, there is some of our population is particularly anxious, and that is something that I believe we can do something about. So if you would introduce yourself and let us know what you want us to know.
Yeah. So again, thank you for having me. My name is Ravi Iyer. I'm here in two capacities, academic and technologist, as you mentioned. So I'm a social psychologist. I have a PhD in social psychology from USC. I've worked with the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, the author of the book, The Anxious Generation, for almost 15 years. And I'm sort of here in part to I'll read a short statement from him, and I can provide a letter from him in support of the bill as well. I'm also here as a technologist. I spent about 5 years, almost 5 years, working at Meta as a research manager, product manager, and data science manager, working on how to improve the design of that platform. And so I think I can speak to some of the very specific ways that this bill would improve the impact on Vermont's kids. So
that would be extremely helpful. Thank you.
My pleasure. So let me just read a short statement. So just for those you don't know, The Anxious Generation is a book which documented the negative effects that smartphones and the heavy use of social media has had on youth around the globe. The book has spent more than 40 weeks at the top of bestseller lists and has been used to motivate students, teachers, administrators, and parents towards regulating social media platforms. Technology can certainly provide benefits to young people, but the current business incentives and design practices of some tech companies, not all tech companies, are leading them to cause vast harm to children and adolescents. Protecting kids from online harm is nonpartisan. It's supported by the majority of Americans, and Vermont legislators have the opportunity to take clear, decisive action, joining the bipartisan movement to protect kids' mental health, attention, and relationships by supporting reforms to how these products are designed. The Vermont Age-Appropriate Design Code would make tech safer for kids by design. This legislation would improve young people's digital experiences by requiring tech companies to implement privacy by default and safety by design protections for kids online. It reflects what we're learning as similar safety by design protections come into effect across the country and around the world. We cannot stand by while tech companies recklessly expose young people to unacceptable, unavoidable, and unnecessary risks. There's no time to wait. We need state legislators to pass the Vermont Age-Appropriate Design Code now. This letter is signed by Jonathan Haidt and Zach Roush, the primary researcher of the book. So I can provide a copy of that letter shortly. And so, they talk a lot about these design practices. They actually are what I worked on at Meta largely. I worked on what you call break the glass measures. They are often sort of more robust ways that you change the design of a platform to be safer for users in general, vulnerable users in particular. A lot of
Excuse me, just one second. I'm sorry, I'm not getting it clearly. So you said break the glass something, and then if you could just explain it, just a little.
So they're often referred to as break the glass measures. And specifically, we would change the algorithm, for example, in certain crisis settings. So, for example, in places like Myanmar or Ethiopia, where there's like a risk of violence, we might reduce the engagement incentives in an algorithm, reduce the weights on reshares or comments. So instead of incentivizing content that gets lots of comments, which may not be the best content, right? You can imagine a piece of health content that gets lots of comments is not necessarily like the most educational piece of content. It tends to be more controversial. And so by removing the incentive to produce content that gets more comments or content that gets more reshares, we would see measurable reductions in, say, bullying and harassment or sexually explicit content. Like those are two metrics of interest, especially to Vermont youth. Another break the glass measure we would sometimes do is increase privacy settings. So for example, there's a feature called locked profile that is available in India is requested especially by Indian women, and it makes it really easy for them to create more privacy by default. It's hard for people to view their profile pictures. They can't get lots of unsolicited message requests. And Instagram rolled out similar features for teens recently. So these are just some of the examples of safety by design measures. And I actually can go into a little bit more specifics about the harms that youth are experiencing and some of the surveys that have been done to show the prevalence of these youth and then connect them to some specific experiences. So, yeah, let me go into a little bit more detail and then happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
So one of the biggest harms that youth report is unwanted usage of platforms, right? And we can all identify with this. Sometimes I talk with adults and kids, and if you ask a group of people if they're trying to use their phones more or less, almost everyone says they're trying to use their phones less. Yet it's full of these apps that are trying to get you to use them more, right? So about 50% of in one survey of Minnesota college students, about 50% of youth said that they have a problem with excessive internet use. In a Common Sense Media study, 70+% of kids said that they felt manipulated by these products to spend more time on them. In a study we did with the Anxious Generation, about 40+% of kids felt regret over using these social media platforms. And that's just to say that, we're not saying they're using these products too much. They are saying they're using these products too much. They often say it interferes with their sleep. They often will say it interferes with their studies. And there are specific design practices of these platforms that make it difficult to stop using them. Some of them are things like the lack of friction, autoplay, infinite scroll. Some of them are like engagement gamification. So like Snapchat Streaks is a good example, where they count how many days in a row you've messaged a friend. And there are many youth who actually report that even when they're on vacation and they're not around their phones, they try to get their parents to actually continue the streak because they feel this pressure to keep up that count, that gamification of how many times they've messaged a friend. Excessive notifications is another way that platforms get you to use these things more. And then algorithms that personally try to get you to watch one more video when you should be sleeping or you should be studying, right? And it's personalized to grab your attention. So unwanted or harmful usage is one category of harm that this bill would address. And then there are some very specific design practices that this bill would outlaw. Another common harm that youth report is unwanted experiences with content, harmful content. In one meta study, 21% of 13 to 15-year-olds reported seeing content that made them feel worse about their lives, and 19% reported seeing unwanted sexually explicit content. So this is unwanted sex. It's not like they're looking for it. They're getting it recommended to them by an algorithm, and they're seeing it against their better judgment. And that's in a 7-day period, right? So every 7 days, 19% of 13 to 15-year-olds using Instagram, which is used by half or over half of youth, are experiencing this every 7 days. And algorithms are again implicated in this. I mentioned how one of the break the glass measures we did was to reduce the incentive for content that gets more reshares or content that gets more comments. And those have been shown to reduce, for example, sexually explicit content or bullying and harassment. And the last category of harm is around unwanted contact, where you're getting messages from strangers that you don't necessarily want. 11% of 13 to 15-year-olds in this meta study report being a target of bullying and harassment every 7 days. 13% report getting an unwanted advance. And a lot of those are facilitated by either loose rate limits, which let small groups of people contact masses of other groups of people, right? So a lot of sextortion, for example, you might have heard of that as a crime. It's often committed by small groups of overseas actors who sort of mass bomb lots of high schoolers trying to create friendships and then solicit trust. A lot of pig butchering schemes start with that. A lot of scams start with that same kind of pattern of mass contact of others. And then also these similar kinds of engagement optimizations, they often can recommend connections between people that, things are likely to be of interest. That unfortunately includes recommending, for example, teenage girls to be followed by like older men. which creates sort of inherent systemic risks in the system where people, you know, in the comment spaces, there can be inappropriate advances there. So those are three kinds of harms: unwanted usage, overusage of platforms, content that people are not looking for, recommended to them by algorithms, and then contact from strangers. And all of these things are things that, you know, to some degree we expect people to be able to control, expect adults to be able to control. But the last thing I'd love to say is, you know, as a psychologist, is that, you know, I think it's very different for kids. So an analogy I would often use is that, you know, it's kind of like donuts versus kale. Like, you know, social media is often, you know, something we use to pass time. We know it's not good for us, but we stop ourselves. And I, as an adult, I can stop myself from eating donuts and eat some healthier food. But I have 3 kids. I don't expect my kids to be able to stop themselves. When I go to a restaurant, I don't let them order everything they want, as much dessert as they want. And that's because kids, you know, we know that their brains are still maturing. They're still developing their self-control mechanisms. They're very sensitive to social reward. And so these kinds of design behaviors take advantage of those vulnerabilities and get them to use these platforms more. You know, one thing that platforms often say is they can give users more parental controls. I can say, you know, across companies, very few users, parents are just too busy. Nobody uses these parental controls, even when they want to. They're just, you know, and the average kid is using 40 apps, right? So for a parent to be expected to control, you know, the individual settings for their kids across 40 apps is just unrealistic. So we need to have these things set by default. We need them not to take advantage of kids' vulnerabilities. And I think the Vermont Age Appropriate Design Code is a great step for Vermont to take. So thank you. That's basically what I wanted to say.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. Sure.
You made a great point about your kids on the last part of that.
Yep.
Where are the parents in all of this? How come they're not playing a bigger role? How come they can't stop what you're want the government to stop? Why don't the parents stop it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of a collective action problem, right? So like, you know, parents could just not give their kids phones at all. But then like, if all the other kids are on Instagram or on Snapchat, it's hard. There's a little bit of a collective action problem.
All the other kids are driving dangerously fast on their car. Don't we take their car away from them?
I mean, there's not that social being left out component, right? So like, you know, I think it's one thing for, it's not a collective activity. It's not where like people are posting things and you're the one kid in your class who's not seeing it. But the other thing I think is, you know, I mentioned 40 apps, right? Like this is Meta's research that like, you know, kids are using 40 apps, having parents try to control settings across 40 apps. I do think parents have a role in this, but I think we can help their role be easier by setting defaults that are reasonable. And then if a parent wants to override the default or give their kid permission, great. But you know, I don't think, you know, I think parents definitely have a role, but we need to help parents have a realistic role to play. And, you know, having, you know, a parent across all their kids manage their settings across 40 apps is not realistic. And empirically, parents just don't do it, right? Adults don't do it either, actually. Nobody uses these controls.
So government should do it for them.
I think government should help. Yes, I mean, I think government should help stop companies from taking advantage of our vulnerable youth. That would be the way I would.
So let me follow up on that. So there's multiple issues that we're talking about here, and the algorithms that you spoke about. Some of them I know what you mean. Infinite scroll. There was another one I don't know what that is. It was like slippery something or
streaks, like Snapchat streaks.
Yeah. Well, streaks I know because that's the one where you have to post every day or your friends, you know, pick on you. But then there was another one that you mentioned. But I guess my question is, have you ever seen a setting that says don't put the algorithms towards me? You know, don't use the algorithms. All I've seen are settings that are privacy settings versus the actual algorithms. And the parents are not going to. First of all, the parents don't have access to the actual coding, and it's the coding that's the problem. So that's a question. And then if you could expand a little bit on the privacy, or it's more, I think it's more than privacy that you talked about with the women in India.
Yep.
That sounds like something that this bill is trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I can expand on both of those. So around algorithms, a good example is, on Twitter, there's a following feed and then there's a For You feed, right? And so, and the For You feed is really, it will show you algorithmic recommendations. And then the following feed will often show you chronologically the people you actually chosen to follow. And they default you into the For You feed for a reason, because that's what is sort of more engaging. And a lot of what we're saying is, we should give kids things they explicitly want as opposed to things that get them more attention, right? So like instead of the thing that gets them to use a platform longer, instead optimize for their explicit preferences. There's actually a paper we wrote with some people both in industry and in academia that we can talk a little bit about the difference between express preference and versus our behavior. But we all experience this in our lives. We all do things that we don't aspire to do, whether it's like eating unhealthy food or whether it's like being on our phones a little bit longer in front of our kids. And so an algorithm can instead cater to our aspirations, what people are choosing to follow, as opposed to view time. And so there are at least examples of algorithms that do that more or less. There's not a good example of that that does it 100%. And we know that when an algorithm optimizes more for explicit preferences, then you get less of these unwanted kinds of content. The second thing you asked about was like privacy. And so, the idea is a few things that are systemic risks in the design of these platforms. One is the ability to mass contact other users. And the second is, who by default, who can contact me, right? So in India, if you click on the lock profile feature, it's harder for people to find you, it's harder for people to visit your profile, and it's harder for people to make friend requests to you unbidden, right? They can't find you and they can't just decide to message you. You have to initiate that friend request. And these are ways that, you can keep kids a little bit safer, right? In a world where like anyone can message anyone, then you can imagine the kinds of requests that might happen to, sextortion requests often are someone pretending to be an attractive person of the other sex, trying to form a relationship with you and then try to get you to send naked pictures of yourself and then extort you as a result, right? And so like those kinds of things all require the ability for someone to contact you without your unbidden, right? Like an unsolicited request. And as I mentioned, these are not uncommon, right? 13% of youth report unwanted sexual advances on these platforms. Right? They're not all from strangers, but we can make these platforms safer by design. And then if a youth says like, I want to actually be contacted by strangers for some reason or another, then they can change that setting. But as a start, we need to make these platforms settings more private by default.
Great. And then the ability of the women in India, how did that come about? How did that setting come about?
I don't know the full history of it, but I do know that this was actually required it's actually, women in India were experiencing a lot of harassment. And so in order to make them feel comfortable using the platform, they had to enable them an easy way to lock their profiles. So that's
they had to do it. So who did Facebook do that on their own?
Yes. Yes,
interesting. Okay. So they do have that ability.
Yeah, just like Instagram made a bunch of changes for teens too recently too, that were to make them more private. It didn't go all the way. A lot of times platforms will do things they're half steps, right? They could go further. And two, it's just one platform. And so in some ways, a platform that does the right thing might be at a disadvantage to platforms that are not doing the right thing. So by creating a standard across platforms, it sort of reduces that race to the bottom incentive.
Right. Because this is a whole brand new world that we're trying to figure out. Go. Yes.
And hi, I'm Senator Rob Plunkett, and you talked about, well, at least you talked about a lot of the harms that will happen to kids, and we're talking about kids, up to 18. And I guess I'll give the example. I'm a prosecutor, and I don't prosecute a lot of sex crimes or a lot of child sex crimes, but what I've seen is that a lot of what happens is that the minors don't disclose. And it'll be a little bit, perhaps over a long period of time. And we were talking a little bit about parental responsibility here. Obviously, we can just take the phones away. But in terms of just seeing the harms that are happening to our kids, can you talk about anything that either these platforms are providing or that parents can just think about when this is happening? How do we see the harms that are happening to our children from these platforms? Maybe you can't answer.
You mean like how would we know when these harms are happening, or how can we detect these harms? Is that the question?
Yeah, I'm saying that a lot of times, very significant child sexual abuse, you cannot see. A parent can't see it.
Yeah.
So this is perhaps, well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the exact same harm. But is there a way for us to say, parents, this is how you can identify the harms to the kids? Or is it just mostly invisible?
You know, I'm not necessarily the right person to answer that question.
Sure.
I don't have like a great answer for it. So rather than venture a guess, I'll just defer. There are people who work more on like I work more on the technology side, like building the platforms versus like the with the parents and on the other side of it. So.
But as far as you know, platforms haven't done anything to notify parents that, hey, your kid might be suffering these harms.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there were such some platforms, but it's not something I'm intimately familiar with.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else? I was really interested about the breaking the glass. That's something new to me. And so can I just paraphrase and you can tell me if I've understood it right, which is, so when there's some sort of situation, and it sounded like this was a like political war, bad situation, that Meta or Facebook would tamp down the processes that cause people to be more explosive in their online persona. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. For example,
I
like
appreciate that they did that. And they did that I appreciate they did they do that on their own?
Yeah, I mean, there was, platforms don't want, the crises in Myanmar, for example, are nobody at any platform or anywhere wants those things to happen, right? And so those kinds of measures were done to, and the question is like that people will ask is like, why don't you do that all the time, right? And that's kind of what the point of this bill is like, well, why don't we have a safer platform at least for our kids all the time, as opposed to just sometimes during crisis settings.
Yes, exactly. And so that's the next question is it for financial gain that they don't keep those systems on?
I mean, I think nobody is like the perfect judge of their own baby, right? Like there's like it's not like so clearly like Machiavellian, like we must make $5 more, so we will put these people in danger. Like nobody thinks like that.
Yeah.
But like nobody's also a perfect judge. No one's an objective judge of their own. You when you own a company, you don't want to believe that these things are harmful, and so that's where society can be helpful to help like adjudicate, as opposed to every company deciding for themselves, which is naturally going to be biased by their own financial performance, right? And nobody wants to believe that what is good for my company is also bad for society. So you need somebody else to help make those decisions, just like we wouldn't make that okay in the food industry. We don't make that okay in the auto industry. Like we need some kind of minimum standard so that everyone's not making these decisions individually as a company.
Great point. Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. Okay, so we have another witness. I don't know. Marissa's available on Zoom. Okay, great. I want to share something with folks, just a personal story. And it has to do with this release document that you should have it on your yeah, this is something I've been carrying around. So it's since 19 hasn't been that long. 2014. And I am the parent of a person who played soccer. And this is a release that the parent had to sign if the kid was under 18 and wanted to play in this Disney soccer showcase, which is a really big deal for kids. And so when we got there and we're getting all ready, I was presented with this, and I just want to read a little bit on the publicity rights at the bottom. It says, I further grant the released party, so that would be my child, the right to photograph, or I'm sorry, the released parties would be Disney. The right to photograph, record, and or videotape me, and further to display, edit, use, and otherwise exploit my name, face, likeness, voice, and appearance in all media, whether now known or hereafter devised, including without limitation in computer or other device applications, online websites, television programming, motion pictures, films, newspapers, and magazines, and in all forms, including without limitation, digitized image or video, and this is my favorite part, throughout the universe in perpetuity, whether for advertising, publicity, or promotional purposes, including without limitation, publication of event activity results without compensation, residual obligations, and it goes on. But there's a lot of hubris in this. And I signed it because I wanted, my child to be able to play soccer. I knew what I was signing. If this is something that I guess the point of this is, as a parent, I didn't appreciate having to sign this to let my kid play soccer. As kids, not even knowing what they're giving away, that's even more concerning. If the next witness at all could weigh in on this, like, is this the type of data and potential uses of the data that could be made more clear and obvious to folks online? And obviously you came with other things that you want to talk about, but do you understand my concern just as a parent and as a person?
Can I comment on it?
Oh yeah, because actually you have
Yeah.
no, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So, I when someone comes in as a guest and or I have something similar, not as in perpetuity in
the universe?
in the universe.
And hopefully you won't after saying
Just full disclosure
Yeah.
for everyone. I'm the executive director of the Upper Valley Aquatic Center in White River Junction. And we have a water park there. And we also have, kids. So there may be a situation where we want to use something in advertising. Or the like. So we do have the parents, have to, and we do make it explicit that we may use them in some advertising. I think this is a bit much, but the difference I think with this is with a child. And this is why I want more of the parent to be involved in this. I don't think a child can make that decision, and they won't. That's why I was very interested in the face recognition and part of it, and not necessarily, as to Sam pointed out, just to check a box that I'm 18 years old. There has to be some fail safe, I think. I think that so. I would want to see the technology become better, or maybe the technology is in, it sounds like it may be. I'm just not, I'm a bit ignorant to if there is. But I to a certain extent, I want the bill to go through, but I need to have the parents involved in some way, because I think, as Sam pointed out so eloquently in another session, that, and I we didn't have this when I was under 18, so but when you if you're under 18, you're say, yes, I'm over 18. So I think it's needed, but I'm just like this, the parent has to sign this. And so
Yeah,
there you go. There's my 3 cents.
great. Thank you.
Exactly
So,
where a lot of the concern is, right?
So do you know what they mean by on throughout the universe?
what do you think they mean? I mean, they probably mean throughout the universe.
So when they make reference to a universe, they're talking about all their associated intellectual properties. So it doesn't actually mean like the universe of space. That's not what
Like
it means.
Marvel
I-
for Disney.
I think it means the universe of perpetuity, but we can find that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just, I mean, it's from 11 years ago. But it's the kind of thing that even as a parent, it concerned me. So having a child make these,
Mhm. I understand,
decisions.
especially the words death and dismemberment. That one.
Yeah, I didn't even talk about that one. And I understand we have to have liability. There's always
Yeah,
liability
yeah.
releases, but there's a balance there. So Marissa Shea, Senior Policy Manager at Reset Tech. Thank you for being here.
So you got to follow that, Marissa. Congratulations.
Hi. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am Marissa Shea. Just quick correction to my title. I'm a consultant for Reset Tech.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And then, I've worked with them and other organizations sort of more broadly on this issue, including, with groups that look specifically sort of at the that aspect of like kids' ability to sort of still navigate the internet, and also, how parents parent, and as a parent myself, have been thinking about this issue from a personal perspective as well. So I have some prepared remarks that I think will get to some of, what was just being discussed and those questions. And then, I'm happy to answer specific questions or sort of go back to that if it doesn't seem to have hit the issues and items you were all just discussing. So as you just heard from Ravi Iyer, the current digital ecosystem did not happen by chance. It's the result of big tech's intentional choices. They're really designing products in a way that is looking to develop online experiences that fixate, intentionally keeping young people and teens locked into their devices. They do this because these types of data practices and design choices have been incredibly lucrative for these companies. A Harvard study published in December of 2023 found that collectively, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, X, and YouTube derived nearly $11 billion in advertising revenue from US-based users younger than 18 in 2022. The study further estimated that of that 11 billion, 2.1 billion of this revenue was generated by targeted ads to users under the age of 12. So it is young people of all ages, sort of not just what we think of as, those 14 to 18-year-olds or 16 to 18-year-olds, but really they're looking at the profitability for their platforms, in terms of how they manipulate the online experiences and the data collected from young people of a range of ages. So, part of what we heard from Ravi Iyer is that we know that these features are business decisions and we know that they're lucrative, but we also know that companies have choices and can design better, safer, less exploitative products. I'm going to give an example that I think sort of highlights why we need, laws and regulations in place in the system rather than sort of relying on these companies to self-regulate or, to make changes, whether it be sort of for better press or because of what consumers want, but really why there's a role for government to play here. And I think Instagram's Project Daisy, which Meta began testing in 2019 to allegedly alleviate the stress and anxiety teenagers may experience due to the number of likes their posts receive, is a great illustration of this. So what Meta did was they turned off the like counts on posts on Instagram and Facebook for a certain subset of users to sort of conduct whether this random sample of hiding posts would have an impact on how young people interacted with the platforms and sort of reported like the, what their overall like effect of that change was. Their internal research from Meta suggested that the provision of like counts was found to create an increase in negative social comparisons and that the removal of that features, still young people used the platform, they still interacted with each other, but they reported having a sort of more positive overall interaction and experience. However, the internal research also found a slight reduction in the commercial metrics related to Meta's overall revenues because ads, tend to rely on how many likes a influencer or other users post or other content receives related to their product. So they were worried about, the overall sort of commercial impact as a result of removing that feature. So as a result, Meta delayed the launch of this option for users until May of 2021. And when they finally sort of rolled it out for all users to be able to utilize, they have it so that it's turned off by default. So users have to be aware that this is an option for them and they have to sort of go into their settings and navigate turning it off. Meta could have chosen to have it immediately shut off by default instead, so that users would have to go in and turn it on. But because they had this concern that it might cut into their ad revenue, they opted for the other option. This is where, Senate Bill 69 comes in. With this bill, as lawmakers, you have the opportunity to stop big tech from putting profits over the well-being of young people. At its core, this bill is simple consumer protection. This type of consumer protection law is common in the real world. Across industries, from food to banking to baby products, regulations are in place to align industry practices with public policy, and the government is tasked with implementing safeguards. For too long, what we've seen is that tech has been allowed to operate outside of a consumer protection model because they're able to sort of pretend that their business model does not involve physical products, and thus they're outside of such a framework. We think that needs to change. We think Senate Bill 69 accomplishes this by creating a minimum of duty of care to covered businesses owe to minors. This minimum duty of care relates to covered businesses' use of minors' personal information and their design of on online service, product, or feature. The bill further requires covered businesses to create default privacy settings and tools, many of which target how adults interact with minors on these platforms. Last year, there was a number of really explosive investigative journalism stories that highlighted how these platforms, because the algorithms prioritize engagement and intention, sort of feed minors into dangerous situations. There was reporting by both the New York Times and the Washington Post that revealed how Instagram and other platforms were connecting minors to pedophiles and other predators online. I think it was the New York Times story actually had journalists creating accounts where they were opening accounts saying, they were 14 or 15 years old, and sort of tracking how it, fed that new profile via their recommendation algorithms to certain users that they did not know or have connections to that, expose them to sort of predatory scenarios. So what this bill would do is sort of create default settings that make it so that minors' profiles aren't searchable, that they can't be contacted via private messaging or sort of other forms of direct contact through unknown, by unknown adults. And all of these things are because of the way, we regulate speech in the First Amendment are structured through default settings, which companies can sort of easily create. They're turned on by default so that parents or young people would have to go in and opt out of sort of those safer settings, versus having to do the opposite and sort of opt in to safety. So we create this sense of safety by default rather than, putting the burden on the user or the parent to make sure such things are turned on. Senate Bill 69 also prohibits certain data and design practices. The bill prohibits the collection, selling, sharing, or retention of minors' personal data beyond what is strictly necessary to provide the online product, service, or feature requested. So what this is, as you're using platforms, say like Instagram, for example, sort of they're recording, depending on what your settings are turned on to, they may be recording where you're physically located. It's tracking sort of how you interact with other content on the platform. All of these are data points that sort of they're collecting and, putting with other data that they've collected on you, and creating sort of a mass data profile that then can be used for their own profit or shared via data brokers for other uses. So this would limit their use of of such collection to just what's necessary to provide you with the product. So we're not saying they can't still, offer you features and even use algorithms, and other things that people like when they're online. We're just sort of creating more consumer choice by creating these settings that you have to opt out of and, limiting then the additional uses with that information that they might be collecting. Additionally, the bill gives young people rights with how they interact with these platforms, allowing them to, like I just said, opt into algorithmic feeds or limit how companies use their personal data to recommend content. So this, I think of as really giving young people back choice and further ensuring that they can search for specific types of content, but, aren't sort of force-fed or manipulated in their online experiences based on what is most profitable, or creates more engagement or more time spent on the app for the platform. It does prohibit overnight notifications and tracking of young people's online activities without notifying them of such tracking because, the research really shows that those features are things that can lead to harm. So rather than sort of making it an opt-out, would prohibit certain things. The bill gives the Attorney General enforcement authority over these provisions. And then furthermore, I just wanted to speak to the bill doesn't have a specific age verification requirement. It does, however, give the Attorney General the authority to issue rules around age verification and institutes some standards and limitations for companies that use age verification, by requiring that they only use any information collected for that purpose for verifying or assuring, an age or an age range, and then requires that they delete it after determining age, and doesn't allow them to sort of combine it with other data on the user and use it for other purposes. In January, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton over a challenge to a Texas law that has some strict age verification requirements. And since we don't yet know which way the Supreme Court will weigh on that issue, it's, I think, a smart regulatory framework to ensure that if companies are going to engage in age verification, that they're limited in their use of that data because it is sensitive personal data, and should only be allowed to be used for the purpose it's being collected. I, want to say that I think what we've heard in Vermont last year and elsewhere is that big tech is going to suggest that this law is the same as the law in Maryland and California, and that, big tech's trade associations have tied those laws up in the courts. They're going to say this bill has the same First Amendment issues. I think that's dishonest. Vermont lawmakers have carefully tailored this bill to be a Vermont-specific model that meets the needs of the state. Yes, like Maryland and California, the bill arose from the age-appropriate design code principles, but it's not a copy of either law. Additionally, what the First Amendment protects, content and speech, is not regulated by the bill. In this bill, the only reference to content is language that specifies children must remain able to actively search for and seek out specific information, and language that exempts content from considerations involved in determining whether a covered business violated the duty of care. So we're specifically saying that they shouldn't consider that type of information that's protected by Section 230 or by the First Amendment when they're determining whether a company is in compliance with this law. So, it's not touching on the things that the First Amendment or Section 230, protect in that way. And then I think this bill, it's important to note that it's not limited to social media, because what we see is that bad data practices and manipulative design aren't limited to social media. Online gaming and other types of platforms also, have many of the same issues. And then it's not limited to sites directed at kids, because, we know things like the PBS app and Sesame Street sort of are already thinking from a kid-specific lens. And, if we're just targeting those spaces, we're allowing tech companies to continue to avoid meaningful oversight. Rather than limiting what kids can see, the data protections here would actually diversify the information seen by children and teens online, because companies will no longer be pigeonholing kids' interests and recommendations through their manipulative design practices. Stronger default privacy settings and better data protection fosters online environments where it's safe for all kids to grow, explore, and express themselves. We know this types of changes are possible, not just from what we just heard from Ravi Iyer in regards to what companies are sort of doing on their own, but the United Kingdom and Ireland have rolled out similar laws. And what we've seen there is that companies have begun modifying their products for kids and teens in ways that, have to put certain considerations above just, profit, but rather makes them consider the risk of harm that their data practice and design choices present. And so what's happened as a result is we've seen Snapchat turn off TikTok has turned off notifications after 10 p.m. for 16 and 17-year-olds. Snapchat has turned all accounts belonging to consumers under 18 to private by default. YouTube has prohibited by default or severely restricted commenting on material posted by users under 18. Instagram, has made changes where users can hide comments from specific other users without that user being notified or aware. TikTok and Meta have implemented restrictions on direct messaging, just, sort of common sense reforms that make their underlying products better for young people. But they weren't necessarily doing until, they sort of had this nudge from regulators abroad. Recently we've also heard big tech lean in on this being a parent's responsibility. And I know some of the questions from this committee sort of speak to that as well. What I just think it's important to think about and call out is that these companies, hire psychologists and other scientists to make sure that their product design is informed by brain science in ways that encourage compulsive use and sort of make these products sticky by design. I have a 5.5-year-old and a almost 2-year-old. And I have policies, and my husband and I are already talking regularly about what those policies will sort of continue to be around their use of different types of technology. And I think most parents, particularly now as the media and other entities have been paying more attention to these issues and the potential dangers and risks associated, are thinking about those things. But as a lawyer, I think about consumer protection and product design. And we don't ask parents to understand how car seats are manufactured and pick from models that may or may not protect their kids, right? Rather, we have regulations that set safety standards for all car seats, and then parents get to pick out which car seat best meets their needs or which they think, is the safest of the safe products. I think what this bill does is sort of set similar standards around these platforms online, right? We set sort of floors that companies must meet for safety in terms of their data use and their product design. But then we, continue to encourage parents through the default settings, through education, through sort of other means to still determine whether or not their kids have access to these platforms, what platforms they have access to, how much time they spend online. And this work, I've been able to work with a number of parents, who have experienced sort of the worst kind of loss. I currently live in Maryland, and working in Maryland on the Maryland Age Appropriate Design Code last year, I was able to work with the Minor family who lost their son to a YouTube choking challenge. In my conversations with his parents, they had strict 30-minute limits on his screen time. It was in that 30-minute limit that, the worst loss imaginable was able to happen to their son. So I just think, parents are doing everything they can, and they're sort of up against a Goliath situation in these scenarios where, the money and resources and things that these companies are putting into the design and use of these products is just something that parents aren't fairly matched towards in regards of making these decisions, right? I think, I've heard recently from parents in other states where they work in the technology industry and felt like they were really well informed about these issues. They had strict protocols for their kids, and they still had experiences during the pandemic when their kids had to be online for school, that they sort of were exposed to certain types of information that led to eating disorders and other types of harm. So I really, just encourage folks to think about, the ways that we can support parents through these sort of types of common sense regulations, and that it's not about government overreach, but just sort of about, evening out the playing field and making sure that parents have the tools and resources they need to be able to better moderate these situations and sort of make those decisions that are right for their families. I think these types of changes, like I said, don't prevent parents from making their own choices. In short, I think this is a reasonable vetted bill that walks the line between online privacy and safety in a manner that will actually benefit kids and keep the internet available to all. I thank you for your time and consideration. And if there's any other questions I could answer or information I could provide, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. That was a lot of information.
Yeah.
Senator?
Yeah. So you mentioned similar bills in Ireland and in Maryland. Do we have any data on that? Probably before and after data. I think that would be helpful for us. And then also, what about the bills can we learn that didn't quite hit the mark or did hit the mark?
Yeah, no. So, the code in the UK went into effect in, I believe, 2021. So they might start to have, we have a lot of evidence of like product change, but I'm not specifically sure about data, but we'll look into that and see if I can send anything to the committee that might be of use. Maryland just passed their law last year, and it just went into effect in October. So we don't have data specific to the state yet. But I do think, it's something we'll start seeing more of. I know, some of the Facebook changes and things that Ravi mentioned were rolled out like this fall are sort of in response to some of the regulations happening, in states like Maryland and elsewhere. It also gives these companies an opportunity to say, like, they're thinking about kids and families and they're being good actors, but at the same time brings them into compliance with states that are trying to regulate in this space. I think in regards to this particular bill, the author and Vermont lawmakers really have been, I think, thinking about what's been going on elsewhere, like with the lawsuit in California and even now some legal challenges in Maryland where they've been very careful to not, make similar considerations around content, to really focus on design. This bill, the way it uses the default settings and sets them to like sort of being turned on by default, so it's an opt-out versus opt-in, I think is an improvement from what we've seen elsewhere, and also strengthens the bill against like allegations that it's, requiring companies to moderate content or things in ways that are violative of the First Amendment. So I do, think the senator's been doing work in that regard. And, if there's anything else we think of that could further sort of support strengthening this bill and making sure it's the best of what we've learned elsewhere, we'd be happy to share that and send that to the committee.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, you made reference to Natchez v. Bonta. Is this bill going to open up the door for lawsuits similar in Vermont, in your opinion?
Sure. Yeah. So, what I think we've seen from the NetChoice, right, that sued in California and now in Maryland, and in a number of other states in regards to parental consent or other types of laws trying to regulate, social media platforms, is that they have a lot of money, and that's sort of an effective strategy to get them to try to, keep lawmakers from regulating tech in meaningful ways. I we're still waiting on the final decision now that the Ninth Circuit remanded the case back down to the circuit court in Northern California. So I don't know like where exactly that law is going to land. I think this law, like, it doesn't include, right, the Ninth Circuit ruled that the data impact assessments were an issue. Like, this bill does not include that language. It doesn't, like I said, it has really specific language around sort of content and ensuring young people still have rights around searching out specific information. I think it tries to make really clear that it's not trying to regulate covered speech. So, I think this is a very different bill than, what got caught up in litigation in California. But I also think that it's, tech's strategy to try to avoid, oversight and accountability by suing or by threatening to sue. So I don't want to, say they won't do that. But I think, for them to try to say that this is the same bill and open to the same legal challenges, isn't an honest read of the legislation before you all.
Okay, thank you, Council.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right, thank you very much. And so you're submitting written testimony also, right? Or you have perhaps?
Yes, I can submit my testimony in writing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Now, in the room, in person, we have Colin Robinson.
I exist in real life.
That's true.
Give out a chair. Okay.
Thank you for being here. You know us all, I believe.
I'm not sure I've had occasion to meet all of you. So happy to do introductions with that.
Okay, so Wendy Harrison, Wyndham District, and now.
Senator Russ Ingles, pleasure.
Senator Bill Major, Windsor District.
And Rob Plunkett, Bennington District.
And
San Jose Leeds District.
right, so we're from all over. It's really great.
Really appreciate it. So for the record, Colin Robinson, I'm the local director for Vermont NEA. And we're excited to be here and share some brief remarks about S69. I also just want to sort of orient, obviously, this is the first time we've been in this committee. So Vermont NEA, we are the union that represents 13,000 public school teachers and school support staff, as well as the teachers at the two of the four historic academy, Burn and Thetford Academy. And our members do everything from classroom teachers, school counselors, social workers, bus drivers, food service workers, paraeducators. They are the folks that are with kids every single day and are on the front lines of seeing the challenges our students are facing. So unlike, I think, many of the other witnesses you've heard from, I'm going to spend no time on the details of what is obviously a very technical bill. But from our perspective, it is the proposition and the need for this. So what we see and what we hear from our members is that there are direct and significant impacts on their ability to provide a strong, robust education to their students and their students' ability to access that education because of direct interferences from the digital media landscape, including cell phones. And that, I will also say, is why we think Senator Williams' bill S21 is also a wonderful companion bill to this. Because the reality is, Senator Williams' bill talks about cell phone usage in schools. Our youth and children are in school 2/3 of the day, or sorry, 1/3 of the day, 2/3 of the day. They're outside of the school. And for all the reasons you've heard from witnesses so far, that's where the issues around cyberbullying, that's where these issues impact student and youth mental health so significantly. Our members prioritize students' health and wellness every single day. That's why we have school nurses in schools. That's why we support universal school meals. That's why we support affordable housing. And right now, what we're hearing from our members, we just had a survey that our members completed recently, a scientific survey, and it literally just came into my email box yesterday. I was stunned to see that the number one issue that they identified their students are facing right now is mental health. 65% of our members identified it as a very serious issue, and 94% identify as a somewhat or very serious issue. Similarly, student behavioral issues, which I would argue is an echo of student mental health concerns and other societal challenges, were seen as a very serious issue by 62% of our members, and both as very serious or somewhat serious issue by 91% of our members. As I said, we were asking these questions just over the past 2 weeks. And, so when students are coming into school because they've been up late, scrolling on their phone, interfacing with the internet, or in the most sad and unfortunate situations, being bullied by peers or others, that means that their social emotional wellness is directly impacting their ability to learn and our members' ability to provide that instruction. My written testimony, I provide lots of statistics, and quite frankly, unless you want me to read through those, I don't necessarily need to, but from the the former US Surgeon General to Pew Research to the CDC, the numbers play out and show that there is a need to address what is in some ways kind of a silent issue, and our members see it every single day in their classrooms. I think one of the other components, and our president, Don Tinney, was a 30-year high school English teacher up at BFA St. Albans. And he talks a lot about how, when he first started teaching, he didn't have to, worry about these types of issues and how they are impacting his students. And that changed dramatically over the past 10 years. And of course, now it continues to get even worse. So, I think in summation, putting statistics aside, putting what our members just told us over the past 2 weeks aside, we know our youth and kids are dealing with more and more complex needs. We know our education system is trying to backfill a lot of societal challenges. And our members are saying, please do things that help us as a community support our youth in a way so they can come to school prepared to learn, prepared to engage with their learning. And so that our members, paraeducators, bus drivers, food service workers, custodians, school counselors are able to focus on the needs of those kids in their classroom, the learning of those kids. And one small thing you could do is to create a space in the internet, which we want them all to interface with, that is safe, that creates opportunities for growth, that doesn't create opportunities for harm. And you pair that, quite frankly, with something like S21. And we believe for the long term arc of student learning outcomes, student mental health outcomes, and ultimately, because all children turn into adults, positive impacts on society going forward. So I'm happy to answer questions that could be useful to committee. But again, testimony is really about sort of the value proposition and how it impacts the youth that our members interface with every single day.
Yes.
I think you identified some very great points. We might differ on about how it got there and what it is, which is fine. I mean, we always we're allowed to disagree and we try to come to agreement when it's all said and done. But it sounds like you are really kind of going towards limiting use of cell phones. Like, we're kind of talking about here a little bit, some of us are anyways, and that might be one of the greatest effects as far as to cure this problem, maybe to limit the amount of use that they actually have on their phone.
Yeah, to be clear, we see it as a total package. And when Senator Williams first introduced his bill last year, I sat in Senate Education and said the same thing about the previous iteration of this conversation, because again, our members do not want to be cell phone police inside school buildings.
Nor should they be.
Exactly. And the reality is the 2/3 of the day that they're not in school, it doesn't just leave them at the door when they walk in the building. And whether that's bullying or other things happening online, quite frankly, if it's homelessness, if it's hunger, like those children are walking through those doors with all of those things.
That's sorry to interrupt you, because that's the point that I'm trying to make is it is a lot more complex out there. It's a more complex world. And I think that we have to be very, very careful about what is causing that complexity? Is it just a cell phone in itself, or is it just the world is just a tougher place?
Mhm.
There's a lot more stuff out there right now. And so, you know, we are not, by passing a bill such as this right here, going to cure kids being mean to one another,
Sure.
kids bullying one another,
Mhm.
and all of that. And I just think that we have to be very, very careful about how we, you know, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to do. And I appreciate what you said about looking at the whole package.
Yeah.
I do.
And if I may, you know, I think as policymakers and as a society, we've decided that it's reasonable to have speed limits on roads. Does everybody obey the speed limits? I don't think so. Anybody who drives down 89 or 91 or any of our other
I
roads.
always do.
Of course, Senator, I'm sure you do. I will admit to being a scofflaw on occasion myself, but
You're a
they.
He doesn't have a car that goes fast.
But they exist for a reason, because we recognize that that is how it is safest to travel down a road. And what we're saying is, these are our youth who have brains that are developing, that quite frankly develop into their 20s, who need the space and capacity to absorb their learning. And if we can provide some reasonable, sensible, sort of guardrails to encourage and support their growth and learning in an environment that's as safe as possible, both inside and outside of school, that's going to be, we think, helpful to our public education system, our teachers and our students.
Great. Anybody else?
No, much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
great.
I'm glad you're here because then we can call you back if we.
Happy to come back anytime. I'm around, happy to have conversations wherever. And if you would like to hear from some educators directly at some point, happy to work to try and make that happen.
That might be helpful, or counselors.
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you all for your work. Appreciate it. Yes.
Okay. Well, that is our last witness. Does anyone have additional witnesses you want to talk about for the future meetings?
I will probably have some, but one more day,
Okay, so just get them back,
Yeah.
please. Okay.
this week,
I might have.
this week.
What's the deadline?
I'm sorry?
What's the deadline?
Well, I thought we could get it done like next week, early next week. So I need to know
That will certainly
really by
be-
Friday
Yeah,
or even
I certainly
tomorrow.
will be before that.
That,
Yeah, as far
Well-
as getting people to come in and testify. If I have somebody come in, it's gonna be well before that deadline. It will be this week.
okay, good. So you'll tell me who it is.
Absolutely.
All that. Okay, perfect. All right. Anything else to talk about before we adjourn to continue tomorrow? And just in case people are watching us every day, we won't be having the floor tomorrow, so we won't be announcing when we're gonna start, but we will start at 1 p.m. tomorrow and